Sorry, technical difficulties. So we actually have kind of moved into chapter 2 quite seamlessly here. Chapter 1 finishes with them agreeing that they're not going to talk to each other about this event again. And then we get to chapter 2, which is called Search for Mr. Hyde. And obviously then you get that very humorous reminder of the idea of hide, seek, that pun there. I've got a mascara out and it's gone missing. There it is. So we start chapter 2 when Utterson goes back, reads the will, reminds himself, and decides that he needs to find out who this Mr. Hyde is, right? Then he goes to see Lanyon. Now, we learn that Dr. Lanyon is another friend of Utterson's, but also was a friend of Jekyll's for years and years and years. They've been friends for a very long time. But as the conversation sort of goes, when Utterson gets to his house, we realise that they're not very good friends at the moment. So essentially, we meet Lanyon, and Lanyon is a very nice man. He's a doctor as well, but his medicine and his training and his interest, the key is that there's a real kind of parallel between his interest in science and the kind of very logical black and white medical side of science, and what we later discovered Jekyll's interest in science to be, which is a little bit more how he calls transcendental. It's a little bit more of the area of science that might be a little bit more, I don't know, for want of a better word, like wishy-washy, not quite as set in stone. And it seems, from what Utterson understands, that they fell out, Jekyll and Lanyon, years ago because of some sort of scientific research that Jekyll had been doing. He describes it as unscientific balderdash, and he actually gets a little bit angry, and he explains that that's why they're no longer friends. They're no longer friends because they just couldn't see eye to eye on the kind of science and experiment that Jekyll was doing. And Utterson sort of says, but by the way, have you ever heard of a person called Hyde? And Lanyon is like, no, never heard of Hyde. And there's sort of not much more that Lanyon can tell Utterson. And so Utterson is left a little bit like, right, well, that didn't help me at all. And so, again, there is more to these characters, and we will do some more focused analysis, but just for the sake of the story. So he kind of goes away and he's like, right, well, I'm really concerned about this. And he goes to bed, Utterson, and he sort of is plagued all night with these horrible nightmares and visions of Jekyll being in real trouble and being blackmailed and having to sort of do this evil man's bidding because of, he keeps assuming it's blackmail. He keeps assuming Jekyll did something silly in his younger years and is kind of being held ransom for it now. And Utterson has a little think to himself about, anything that he might have done in his past that someone could do that to him about. And he kind of almost gets a bit smug because he's like, well, I don't really think there's anything I've ever done that's that bad. So again, this idea of Utterson being this stand-up guy, but also hypocrite, because he was the one not a chapter ago saying, no, I don't get involved in people's business. He's out all over London now trying to find out who Hyde is. So, not that perfect, Utterson. Anyway, so he decides when he wakes up from this horrible night's sleep where he's been worried about Jekyll all night, he decides that he needs to put a face to the name. He needs to actually find Hyde and work out what is going on here. What is the link? Why is it there? Why does he feel like he has to look after this guy Hyde, give him all his stuff in his will? So he says, if he shall be Mr. Hyde, I shall be Mr. Seek. Ha. And he decides that he is going to haunt the doorway that he knows Hyde went in by that night in the story, okay? And so at this point, we discover that even when he kind of should be doing other things, Utterson chooses for a while to spend all his time waiting to sort of catch Hyde out. And so it says, at noon when business was plenty and time was scarce, he would do it sort of in his free time. He would do it when he should be working. He just wouldn't let it go. Again, not somebody who kind of lets his brother go to the devil in his own way. I'm not going to blame him for it. He was lying when he said he did, but he clearly cares about his friend and he doesn't want him to come to any harm. So he is going against his kind of way of living, as it were. Finally, one evening, he hears some footsteps coming along. It's very dark, it's very quiet. and he hears these footsteps, and finally he comes sort of face to face with Hyde. Now, Hyde is kind of enshrouded in darkness at this point, so he doesn't get to look at him straight away, but they have a conversation. Hyde is pretty unfriendly. Hyde sort of tries to catch Utterson out a little bit, because he's like, well, how do you know me? And he's like, oh, we have a friend in common. He's told me this. And Hyde's a bit like, no, he never told you that, you're lying. And Utterson is kind of like, come on, that's not a gentlemanly way to speak. And again, you get this real sense here of Hyde being much less bothered by the expectations of how you're supposed to behave, how you're supposed to speak to people, and so on and so forth, than Utterson is. Utterson's clearly sort of better bred and more a part of the society that that the doctors and the lawyers would be in, whereas Hyde seems to be Hyde is just a different, again, we'll get onto what sort of person Hyde is in a minute. So they talk for a little while, and very quickly, after they've sort of had a conversation where Hyde gives Utterson his address, so we discover this isn't actually where Hyde lives. He just has a key to get into this building. Now, at this point, we make a discovery. We learn that this doorway is actually not a doorway, obviously, to Hyde. I don't know if you can hear me because I'm putting lip balm on. Hang on. This doorway turns out to be something that we didn't expect. So what Utterson does is, when Hyde essentially runs in through that door after not wanting to talk to him anymore and slams the door behind him, Utterson's left feeling very worried and very perplexed, because he's got now time to ponder and dwell upon what kind of a character Hyde is. And he, again, has this same odd reaction that the people in Enfield's story had. He found him utterly despicable. And he says it's not that he has any particular malformation, but yet he gives off this sort of aura of being deformed in some way, of having something physically wrong with him, even though there's nothing that you can put your finger on. Yes, he's ugly. Yes, he's dwarfish. Yes, he's this. Yes, he's that. But there's nothing actually that I can put my finger on. But yet he seems wrong. Okay. And again, we're going to talk about why when you know more of the story, because I don't want to give away bits before. But we're going to hold on to this because there's so many conversations about why Hyde looks the way he does. And we can come on to that. So, Utterson, at this point, while he's pondering and wondering why he looks the way he does, Utterson wanders round the road, and he goes round the corner to where, essentially, if you imagine that building and the doorway of the building's there, he goes round to where the front of the building would be, which is sort of in a square nearby. So he's gone round to the other side. And it turns out that that door is the back entrance to Jekyll's house, okay? And therefore, Hyde has been given access to come and go through the back door of Jekyll's house. And so we learn this because he goes around and he knocks on the front door and he asks the butler, Poole is his name. He asked the butler, Poole, is Jekyll home? And Poole says, no, he's not around at the moment. And so the Utterson sort of says, well, while I'm here, do you know anything about this Hyde character? And Paul's a bit like, well, yeah, we've been told just to sort of give him what he wants. If he ever wants to come and go, he's allowed to. He's been given full access to the house, but he comes in through that back entrance. Now, this is another example of the duality that is rife throughout this novel, because ultimately, even the settings, even the buildings become dual, in the sense that you've got this back entrance, this sordid, neglected, sort of, unlooked after entrance, which is associated with Hyde, and the front of the house, which is much more welcoming, well lit, affluent looking, in a nice part of the sort of in a nice square, that's associated with Jekyll, who's obviously the well-meaning doctor, the complete opposite of Hyde. So he asks about Hyde, and we learn that yes, Hyde is being given access to the house and he is being allowed to sort of come and go as he pleases, which leads Utterson feeling even more confused again and more worried, because why is this man suddenly being allowed to just come and go into Jekyll's home? How does that work? It doesn't make any sense. And so by the end of this chapter, chapter 2, because we accidentally did 2 chapters because I got confused about where chapter 1 and chapter 2 begins. By the end of this chapter, we realise that actually Utterson doesn't feel any better for having met Hyde. If anything, he feels worse, because now he's got this real sense of confusion about what kind of a person Hyde is. He also talks about he thinks to himself once he's walked away from Hyde, he says, what is it that makes me feel this loathing and this disgust when I look at him? And he actually theorises, is it his foul soul that is actually manipulating how he looks on the outside? So is he so evil that it's actually transfiguring his clay continent, his face, his body? It's actually making him look even worse and more disgusting because the evil is shining through him. Now, that's a really interesting point, because actually Utterson calls the truth before any other truths come out. We get to all the way to chapter 10 before someone else also theorises almost the exact same thing. So Utterson is kind of working it out, maybe without even realising he's working it out. But it is ultimately a mystery, this novel. We kind of know, because we know the story of Jekyll and Hyde so well. We know the connotations when someone is called a Jekyll or a Hyde. But a Victorian reader of the time would actually be going, well, who is this Hyde? Oh my God, why is he linked with Jekyll? Why is he being allowed to go into Jekyll's house? Oh, Jekyll's not there now, okay. And not putting 2 and 2 together, not making those links yet. So we've met Utterson, we've met Jekyll. We haven't met Jekyll because Jekyll's not there when Utterson goes to see him, but we've heard of Jekyll. We've met Hyde, we don't like him. We've briefly met Enfield, who only comes in another, I think, 1 time or so. And the next chapter we get onto will be when we actually meet Dr. Jekyll for the first time. And we see that he is an interesting character. Yes, he's good, but there's definitely elements of him that I want to unpack a little bit. So that'll be next video. Sorry for the technical interruption halfway through this one. And hopefully I will see you soon.